If you've been swept away by this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always heartwarming to see how far these tales travel across the world. Share your country or city in the comments below, and let's keep this beautiful community growing. And kindly subscribe to the channel. In the year 1817, England stood at the delicate edge between grace and change. The thunder of Napoleon's cannons had faded, and with peace came a strange unease, an age where propriety reigned more fiercely than passion, and where fortunes could crumble under the weight of one poor harvest or one unwise alliance. Across the manicured lawns of the gentry, marriages were made not in tenderness but in quiet desperation. Among these unions of convenience, none would stir the whispers of London quite like that of Lady Eleanor Whitcomb and Nathaniel Sinclair, the Duke of Ashbourne. Lady Eleanor was the youngest daughter of Sir Richard Whitcomb, a baronet of fading consequence whose family name carried more dust than silver. Their ancestral home, though grand in its Georgian symmetry, bore the subtle decay of neglect, the carpets threadbare, the chandeliers missing their crystals, the servants fewer with each passing season. Yet Eleanor had been raised with all the precision of her rank. Her education was impeccable, her French fluent, her pianoforte playing admired. Still, beneath the practiced smiles and graceful curtsies, there lingered something untamed, a spark of mind and will that her mother prayed would be softened by marriage. She was 22, a dangerous age for an unmarried lady, and though her beauty, dark hair, thoughtful eyes, a composure that bordered on regal, had not gone unnoticed, offers of fortune had not followed. When word first reached her of the Duke's interest, disbelief had been her first response. The Duke of Ashbourne was not a man one imagined in search of a wife. He was England's most wanted duke not by affection, but by intrigue, a man whose immense fortune and cool reserve drew both envy and fascination. He had inherited his title young, following the sudden death of his elder brother, and in the years since, had become a figure of both political influence and whispered tragedy. The gossiping matrons of Mayfair told a dozen different stories, that he was incapable of love, that he kept the portrait of a lost fiancée locked in a gilded frame, that he had withdrawn from society because grief had hardened him into marble. Eleanor had heard every rumor. Yet when he called upon her father, impeccably dressed, voice low and deliberate, there was nothing of the ghostly figure the stories described. His gaze was intelligent, his manner formal, and though not unkind, there was in him the stillness of a man too long accustomed to solitude. He spoke little of himself, and nothing of affection. His proposal was direct, a union that would restore the Whitcomb fortunes and provide the Duke with a wife of suitable character and discretion. Sir Richard had accepted before Eleanor could catch her breath. Her mother wept with relief. Her father toasted to salvation. Eleanor had simply nodded, her composure masking the silent conflict within. Duty was the air she had breathed since birth, and duty now demanded obedience. Still, when she looked upon the Duke, the perfect symmetry of his features, the gravity of his silence, she felt both admiration and foreboding. There was something unreachable in him, a distance she could not yet name. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a morning as pale and cold as a pearl. St. George's, Hanover Square, was filled with society's finest, their whispers fluttering like ribbons in the air. Every eye followed the Duke as he entered, his bearing as impeccable as his reputation. Eleanor followed on her father's arm, her gown a masterpiece of ivory silk and Chantilly lace, her expression composed though her heart trembled beneath the fabric. The ceremony was brief, every word spoken with reverence and restraint. When the ring slid onto her finger, she felt the weight of more than gold. It was the weight of her family's salvation, her own unchosen fate. Outside the church, the carriages lined the square, horses stamping impatiently against the cobblestones. The Duke offered his arm, guiding her with mechanical politeness. The streets blurred past as the carriage rolled toward his London residence, Ashbourne House, a monument of pale stone and quiet grandeur. She tried to speak once or twice, to thank him for his kindness or remark upon the weather, but his answers were measured, almost distant. He seemed absorbed in thoughts he did not intend to share. When the carriage halted before the great entrance, she gathered her courage. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I am grateful for your generosity. I shall endeavor to make Ashbourne a happy home." He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since the vows. His eyes, gray as tempered steel, held hers for a long, unbroken moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but absolute. You'll spend the wedding night alone. The words did not pierce her like a wound. They settled upon her instead like frost, slow, spreading, irreversible. She could not speak, could scarcely draw a breath. He stepped down from the carriage, offered his hand as courtesy demanded, and led her into the marble hall. Servants bowed low as the new duchess was announced, though she felt less a bride than a guest in her own life. Within minutes, he excused himself to his study, leaving her standing before the grand staircase, her veil still unpinned, her future newly written in silence. In the hours that followed, Eleanor wandered through the echoing chambers of Ashbourne House. The portraits lining the corridors seemed to watch her with restrained curiosity, the dukes and duchesses of centuries past, painted in stiff dignity. The household staff, polite but wary, spoke little. When she entered the library, she found it vast and immaculate, every volume arranged with military precision. There was no evidence of warmth, no suggestion that laughter had ever filled these rooms. Only the faint scent of parchment and old oak lingered in the air, as though time itself had chosen to hold its breath. That night, as she sat before her dressing mirror, she studied the reflection of a woman both married and alone. She thought of her mother's tears of joy, her father's handshake with the Duke, the vows spoken beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. George's. She had done her duty, as all good daughters must. Yet something within her rebelled against the notion that this was to be her life, a cold alliance, a house without tenderness. She blew out the candle and lay awake until dawn, her mind restless with questions she dared not voice. In the days that followed, the scandal began to stir. Servants whispered that the marriage had not been consummated. London, ever hungry for gossip, feasted on speculation. Some claimed the Duke despised his bride, others that he was cursed by the sins of his past. But Eleanor, proud and composed, met the curious eyes of society with quiet dignity. She attended luncheons, wrote polite notes of thanks, and maintained the image of harmony expected of her rank. If she suffered, she did so privately, with the stoicism her upbringing had perfected. As for the Duke, he was as courteous as ever, yet remained a man of absence, present at breakfast, gone by midday, locked in his study until late hours. He spoke to her only of practicalities, never of affection. Still, Eleanor sensed something restless in him, a tension beneath the surface calm. When he thought himself unobserved, his expression changed, haunted, almost sorrowful. She began to wonder what ghost had claimed his heart long before she ever entered his world. And so their union began, not in love but in silence, a silence that filled the corridors of Ashbourne House, that seeped into its very walls. Yet within that silence, a story waited to unfold, of a man chained by guilt, and a woman who would one day teach him that even the coldest heart could be thawed by the quiet persistence of love. Morning light crept over the rooftops of Grosvenor Square, gilding the windows of Ashbourne House in pale gold. Within, the Duchess moved through her days like a ghost in silk. The weeks following the wedding had unfolded in quiet repetition. Formal breakfasts, letters unanswered, polite dinners where silence served as their constant third guest. The servants had grown accustomed to the stillness that accompanied their employers, and though their voices softened in her presence, Eleanor could sense the question that hung behind their courtesy. What kind of marriage was this? She had wondered the same each night, staring at the empty chair across from her at supper, where only candlelight flickered in place of a husband. Nathaniel Sinclair, the Duke of Ashbourne, was a man who conducted his life as if emotion were a dangerous indulgence. He rose early, spent long hours in his study, and disappeared for business in Parliament or the countryside. To most of London, he appeared unchanged, the same impenetrable figure who commanded respect wherever he went. Yet beneath that composed exterior lay a mind divided between duty and remorse. He had married for obligation, to silence the gossip surrounding his name and to fulfill expectations of lineage. He told himself the arrangement was practical, sensible, safe. What he had not anticipated was the quiet persistence of the woman he had chosen. Eleanor was not the timid creature society imagined her to be. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her intelligence revealed not through defiance but through composure. When the Duke avoided her, she filled the house with purpose, organizing the library, overseeing the servants, tending to correspondence that had long been neglected. The staff, once uncertain of her, began to admire her steadiness. She treated them not as inferiors but as companions in stewardship. It was said below stairs that the new Duchess had breathed life into Ashbourne's long silent halls. Still, none dared speak of the absence of laughter, the kind that only comes when love inhabits a home. When the London season began in late spring, invitations poured in for the newlyweds. Eleanor accepted, as duty required, though Nathaniel's agreement came only after hesitation. Their appearances together became the subject of fascination. At Almack's, the grand assembly rooms glittered with diamonds and gossip. When the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne entered, conversation faltered. He, tall and restrained, offered his arm without warmth. She, radiant in silver satin, held her head high despite the cold that lingered between them. Some claimed the Duke's indifference was proof of disdain, others whispered that he guarded a love too fierce for public eyes. Eleanor heard every speculation yet answered none. She had learned that dignity was armor enough in a world ruled by perception. Still, the charade of harmony weighed upon her. During one such evening, as couples waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, she found herself watching her husband from across the ballroom. He stood apart, speaking quietly with an older statesman, his profile lit in gold. There was beauty in his stillness, but it was the beauty of stone, immaculate, untouchable. She wondered whether any warmth remained behind that disciplined gaze. When their eyes met for the briefest moment, he inclined his head, a gesture so polite it felt like distance made flesh. Back at Ashbourne House, he found her by the fire one evening, reading by candlelight. For once, he did not turn away. "You are restless," he observed. "Only confined," she replied softly, not lifting her gaze from the page. It is difficult to live among so many rooms when one's heart occupies none. He hesitated, uncertain whether to answer. "You are mistress of this house. Surely that must count for something." She closed the book. "A house may belong to me, Your Grace. But belonging is not the same as living." He said nothing more, retreating behind the shield of his study. Yet her words lingered like a quiet echo he could not dispel. The truth was that Ashbourne had not always been silent. Years earlier, it had been filled with laughter, his brother Henry's laughter. The memory of it haunted Nathaniel like a ghost that refused to rest. Henry had been the opposite of him, charming, impulsive, beloved by all. And it had been Henry's death, sudden and violent, that had reshaped Nathaniel into the man the world now saw. The duel had taken place at dawn, on a frost-bitten field near Devon, born of pride and jealousy. A woman had been involved, a woman both brothers had loved. Henry's fall had been instant, Nathaniel's ruin far slower. From that morning on, he had sworn never again to love where love could destroy. The vow had preserved his composure and cost him his soul. Eleanor did not yet know this truth, but she sensed its shadow in him. Each time he looked at her, she felt he was searching for something long lost. She did not press him with questions. She simply observed, as one might watch a bird perched on the edge of flight. Slowly, the distance between them began to shift, not with words, but with gestures. A shared glance across the breakfast table. The faintest curve of a smile when she teased him about his unread letters. Small, fragile things, but enough to suggest that the man of marble might still be capable of warmth. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as a storm rolled over London, Eleanor found herself alone in the library when thunder rattled the windows. Nathaniel entered moments later, rain glistening on his coat, his expression weary. "The carriage could barely make it through the streets," he muttered, removing his gloves. "You should have stayed in Parliament," she replied, rising to pour him a glass of brandy. He looked at her, startled by her easy familiarity. "And leave you here to face the thunder alone?" It was the first jest she had heard from him, quiet though it was. She smiled faintly. "I've known greater storms." Something passed between them then, something unspoken yet undeniable. He took the glass, their fingers brushing briefly, and for an instant his composure faltered. When he finally looked away, his voice had softened. "You should not be kind to me, Eleanor. It is not deserved." Her answer was simple. Kindness is never deserved. That is what makes it kindness. After that night, the house changed subtly. He began joining her for breakfast, sometimes even for an evening walk through the gardens. They spoke of trivial things, the weather, the estate, the endless parade of invitations. Yet beneath each conversation pulsed a fragile curiosity. He found himself listening for her laughter, watching how the sunlight caught in her hair. She, in turn, began to see in him not coldness, but fear, an armor forged to protect something deeply wounded. Still, London's eyes remained upon them. One man in particular, Lord Peregrine Vale, a charming acquaintance from Eleanor's girlhood, began to visit her at social gatherings. His attention, though innocent, stirred murmurs. The Duke noticed. When Vale bowed over Eleanor's hand at a reception in Berkeley Square, Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That night, his civility was sharp enough to cut. "You seem much admired, Duchess," he said, his tone unreadable. "Do you disapprove?" she asked quietly. He paused before answering. "I do not approve of gossip, and you are fast becoming its subject." The words, though cold, revealed the tremor beneath. She saw it, the trace of emotion he fought so hard to deny. It was not control but fear that shaped his silence. Fear of what might awaken if he allowed himself to care. Later, alone by the window, Eleanor watched the city lights shimmer in the fog and understood that affection, no matter how carefully hidden, had begun to stir between them. He was still the man who had told her she would spend their wedding night alone, but she sensed the distance narrowing, inch by reluctant inch. And though she could not yet see how their story would end, she knew this much. The walls around his heart were not made of stone after all, they were made of sorrow, and sorrow, with enough patience, could be undone. Autumn arrived with the slow melancholy of fading roses. The London season waned, and with it, the endless parade of obligations. The Duke of Ashbourne withdrew from society as easily as a tide receding from shore, claiming business at his country estate. Eleanor followed, though she sensed that what drew him there was not duty, but retreat. Ashbourne Park lay nestled among misted hills, its stone facade half hidden beneath ancient ivy. To her, it felt both sanctuary and prison, a place where silence deepened rather than dispersed. Yet, within that quiet, the truth that had long hovered unspoken between them began to take shape. The days passed in subdued rhythm. Nathaniel spent long hours on horseback or in his study, his solitude now more a habit than a need. Eleanor filled her time with the management of the estate, walking through the autumn gardens, conversing with tenants, and reading in the library where their uneasy companionship had first begun. The air between them was gentler now, but fragile, like glass that might crack at the faintest tremor. She had come to understand that his distance was not born of disdain, but of grief too long concealed. What she did not yet know was the full weight of the memory that haunted him. One evening, as twilight deepened into a violet dusk, Eleanor found herself drawn to the west wing, a part of the house she rarely entered. The corridor smelled faintly of dust and lavender. At its end stood a door left slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the dying light from a tall window. Upon the desk lay a miniature portrait framed in gold. A young man, fair and laughing, so unlike the Duke that for a moment she thought it must be another. But then she noticed the eyes. Gray, the same storm gray as Nathaniel's, though untouched by sorrow. It was his brother. Beneath the portrait rested a pair of dueling pistols, polished but unused. Understanding came not as shock but as quiet revelation. The pieces of his restraint, his fear of love, his self-imposed solitude, all converged into one undeniable truth. She did not tell him she had seen it. Instead, that night at dinner, she watched him carefully as candlelight played upon his face. He seemed tired, his expression distant. When he finally looked at her, there was a flicker of vulnerability she had not seen before. "You do not ask me why I am as I am," he said suddenly, as if the silence had compelled confession. "I thought perhaps you would tell me when you were ready," she replied. He looked away, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "Some things are better left buried. The dead should not be disturbed. But the living," she said quietly, "should not live as if they are among them." He met her gaze then, and for a moment, the weight of all his restraint faltered. "You are braver than you should be," he murmured, almost to himself. In the days that followed, his restlessness grew. She heard him pacing his study at night, the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors like a man arguing with his own past. Finally, Unable to bear the distance any longer, she went to him. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolling over the hills. He stood before the hearth, eyes fixed on the fire as if searching for something within its depths. "Tell me," she said softly. "Tell me what binds you so tightly that even love cannot reach through." He turned, his expression torn between anger and despair. "Love." The word escaped him as if it were both foreign and forbidden. "Do not speak to me of love, Eleanor. I have seen what it destroys." She stepped closer, unflinching. "Then tell me how it destroyed you." He stared at her for a long moment before the words came, raw and halting. "My brother, Henry. He was everything I was not, light where I was shadow. We both loved the same woman, a countess recently widowed. I tried to step aside, but he challenged me, accusing me of betrayal. I meant only to stop him, but pride, mine, would not yield. At dawn, he fell by my hand." Eleanor's breath caught, though not in horror. "And you have punished yourself ever since." He nodded, the motion barely perceptible. "I swore never again to love, never to risk destroying another life with what I feel. You must understand, my heart is not safe." She reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "No heart is. But to lock it away is to let it wither. Your brother's death was tragedy, not proof that you are unworthy of love." He looked at her then, truly looked, and in that gaze was the first flicker of surrender. The storm outside roared against the windows, thunder answering the turmoil within. When he finally spoke, his voice was scarcely a whisper. "Eleanor, I do not know how to begin again." "Then let me begin for us," she said. "One small kindness at a time." For a long while they stood in silence, the only sound the rain on the glass. Then, as though yielding to an invisible force, he took her hand. His touch was uncertain, the touch of a man who had forgotten tenderness. She did not move, did not speak, only let him hold the truth of her presence until the storm began to fade. The following morning, the household noticed the change. The Duke took breakfast with his wife, spoke to her of the gardens, asked her opinion on estate matters. His eyes no longer carried the same guarded distance. When they walked the grounds together, he would occasionally reach for her hand, not as command, but as gratitude. The servants whispered that the Duchess had softened him, though the truth was that she had only reminded him of what it meant to be alive. As winter drew near, they withdrew entirely from London. Invitations went unanswered. Gossip eventually lost interest. At Ashbourne Park, the days unfolded in quiet companionship. Nathaniel began to laugh again, awkwardly at first, as though rediscovering an old language. Eleanor's laughter answered, light and sincere. The ghosts that had once haunted the house grew still, and for the first time since his brother's death, the Duke slept without dreams. Yet healing was not the same as forgetting. On a pale December morning, he took her to the West Wing, to the room she had once entered in secret. Together they stood before the portrait. "He would have liked you," Nathaniel said quietly. "Henry was never afraid of speaking his heart. I have spent half my life trying not to be him, and in doing so, I became something less." Eleanor placed her hand upon his arm. "Then honor him by living, not by mourning." He turned to her, his expression unguarded, and for the first time she saw peace in his eyes. "You have undone me, Eleanor. I vowed never to love again, and yet—" She silenced him with a gentle shake of her head. "Do not vow, Nathaniel. Just live." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and unhurried. The world beyond the window was hushed, the land cloaked in silver. In that stillness, the past seemed to loosen its hold. They stood together, two souls once bound by duty, now tethered by something stronger, understanding. In the months that followed, their union grew not through grand gestures but through quiet constancy. Where once the house had echoed with emptiness, it now carried the faint warmth of laughter, of footsteps shared. Those who saw them later spoke of a marriage transformed, though few knew how fragile and hard one that peace had been. And yet, beneath every moment of calm, Eleanor knew love was never the absence of pain but the courage to face it. When she looked upon the man beside her, the most wanted duke in England, once untouchable, now simply hers, she felt no triumph, only gratitude. For though he had once said she would spend their wedding night alone, fate had given them something far rarer: the promise that no heart, once awakened, need ever be alone again.